In 2011, the Metal Gear Solid HD collection was released for the PS3, PS Vita, and Xbox 360. MGS 2, 3, and Peace Walker were the only games advertised to be part of the deal, but what they don't tell you is that MGS 3 still retains the Subsistence release's ability to play Metal Gear 1 and 2 for the MSX, fully translated for the first time. So despite what you've been told, this compilation actually has live video games. This entire franchise hasn't been accessible as it was in the past. All of these games are stuck on 6th and 7th gen systems. No new re-releases in sight until the recent announcement of the Master Collection. I feel like this has created a whole generation of fans who only know about Metal Gear from the 2 games that are on Steam. Rising, a spin-off that is way over the top even for Metal Gear standards but still retains the heart of the series, and 5, a big fat waste of everyone's time. With all this widespread familiarity with this world and its characters, this undying presence in the collective consciousness, it's easy to imagine that there are tons and tons of people out there with little experience with this franchise who would probably enjoy delving into it. Of course, tons of Metal Gear boomers will tell you all kinds of things about the games and how you should play them, which ones are canon, which are semi-canon, and which versions of the games give the ideal and authentic experience. That said, I didn't get into the series until 2015, so I guess that makes me a Metal Gear millennial. I still remember buying the HD collection, wanting to finally jump into this series and see what all the hubbub is about, and despite being greeted by the 3 games advertised on the tin, I went into Metal Gear Solid 3 for the sole purpose of playing Metal Gear 1, pre-Solid, the original that started it all, the origin of all this covert mayhem. Now me, I have a surprisingly high tolerance for the jank of games a decade older than myself. I was forged in the fires of playing Zelda 1 and 2 with a fucking GameCube controller. I've been watching AVGN since 2008, so while I sure as shit didn't grow up in that era, I think I've grown up around it enough to say that I'm at least somewhat acquainted. And so, I played through the game, dying a bunch, getting frustrated, looking up guides, and all the while I kept thinking, this game is a lot of fun! And you know what? Same for its sequel, a game I enjoyed even more for its more coherent design, greater depth of gameplay, and truly compelling story. So as you can imagine, it rubbed me the wrong way that Konami just kinda tucks these games into a corner where you can barely notice them. Beyond just the HD collection, the Master Collection also seemingly treats them as cheap throwaway bonuses. The Solid games get top billing, while the originals have to be kept down, like an annoying kid at their older sibling's piano recital. What makes me even madder though is that fans of the series also tend to look down on these games in similar ways. Not necessarily saying they're bad, but acting like they don't exist or they don't matter, or you should just skip them. To be frank, I think that's all complete and utter bollocks. Especially when people say these games aren't important, but fucking Peace Walker is. Metal Gear 1 and 2 certainly aren't as rich with story as their successors, but they sure as shit contribute a lot more than the entire Missing Link saga. Yeah, I know some people call this stretch of Big Boss-centric games the Peace Walker saga, but that's only one game of the 4. I'd call them the Big Boss prequels, but then I'd be slandering MGS3 and I'd rather fucking die! This weird idea that manifested from the Metal Gear community of the first 2 games being unimportant feels uncharitable towards not just their legacy, but the inherent value that lies within. And yes, I do believe that these games hold up really, really well. Far from perfectly, but still enough to make them worth looking at, whether you're a stranger to this franchise or already well-versed. This video has 2 target audiences. New fans who have little to no experience with this franchise and are interested in trying it now that Konami is giving them an excuse, and existing Metal Gear fans who have played most, if not all, of the Solid games but have never felt the need to pay the MSX games any mind. For that first group, I'm gonna keep my reviews of these games relatively brief and spoiler-free, but then I'm gonna get more in-depth about their role in the series, which requires me to spoil basically every single Metal Gear game, so proceed accordingly. Being a pioneer of its genre, Metal Gear 1 doesn't have an awful lot of depth to its stealth mechanics. Enemies have severe tunnel vision, die in a few punches or a single bullet, and usually can't be manipulated in any meaningful ways, but that doesn't mean that the game doesn't do a lot with them. Unlike more modern stealth games that are all about using your tools to your advantage to play with the enemy AI, this game has a greater emphasis on observing their patrol patterns in order to slip by. There's nothing stopping you from just running in recklessly and shooting down everyone in sight. In fact, it might even be easier to do that in some cases. The game is pretty damn generous with rations and ammo, so it's not like it's a huge resource investment. For your first playthrough though, I think the best thing you should know is to take your time assessing the situation and trying to avoid reckless moves, while also taking mental note of what certain rooms will look like upon entering, lest you get detected after taking one step too soon like I often did. Whether this form of stealth gaming is your cup of tea is up to you, but I think it's fun and reasonably challenging in spite of its shortcomings. Of course, while stealth is the bread of Metal Gear, the puzzle adventure aspect is the butter. Not every game in the series is a non-linear labyrinth, but most of them have their fair share of exploration and into cool puzzles, making sure you put your brain into good use for more than just sneaking around. I'm not gonna mince words with you, this game can be hella cryptic and confusing, but I think that compared to other non-linear adventure games of the era, it makes a good effort to help point you in the right direction with the codec. Sometimes you have to do something unorthodox to advance, and calling Big Boss will provide you with a hint for whatever obscure method is required for that section. Sometimes you need to find a new piece of equipment, and calling Schneider will tell you the exact floor of which building you can find it in. Beyond the codec, there's also the various POWs you can rescue who will thank you with good advice. Of course, this was '87, and back then, in-game objective lists and automatic note-taking weren't invented yet, so if your short-term memory doesn't serve you well, or you just take long breaks while playing games, you might just be tempted to look up a walkthrough just for a reminder of what the game already told you. And maybe a couple other for the times when the game just forgets to leave any hint at all, like having to call Jennifer here to open this door. What doesn't help is that the advice from POWs is shown only once. You can never revisit them to hear it again, and none of your codec pals write it down to remind you. But even if they did, there's another problem. The advice you get from the codec is dependent on which room you're in. It doesn't track flags about what items you have or which story events you've witnessed, so if you get lost, wander around, and want to get some advice a second time, you'll have to retrace your steps and check the last important room you've been in. What also doesn't help is that in the second building, the one where most of the game takes place, elevators move in only one direction. If you took the up elevator to floor 3 and just remembered you need to be on floor 2, the only thing you can do is walk all the way to the down elevator. This is not my idea of fun. Elevators are also basically the only consistent checkpoint the game gives you, so as annoying as they can be with their restrictions, they are still a valuable asset. The way card keys work in this game is also something I don't miss. It's ultimately not a huge issue, but having to trial and error through each card at every door gets real tiresome anyhow. Also, Schneider's frequency is 120.79. The game is supposed to tell you this early on, but the event is bugged and has not been fixed in any of the re-releases, so it is unfortunately something that you cannot learn without looking it up. If it wasn't obvious enough, these are games that were very clearly designed for the audience of the time first and foremost, so the best way to enjoy them is to approach them from the perspective of that 80s kid target audience. Even the Solid games are like this to an extent, so really, this is an idea you should remember no matter what Metal Gear you're playing. It's very much a game that requires you to feel around, take mental notes so that you can put pieces together, while still exercising caution to get by enemies unscathed. It's not the easiest game, and it sure as shit won't be fun for everyone, but I think it's worth checking out if you're into retro games of this sort, doubly so if you're a Metal Gear fan already. If you're not a Metal Gear fan, I think this is a good introductory game, but it might not be ideal, especially if you aren't predisposed to confusing ass 80s games like I am. The story is pretty good and reasonably fleshed out for the time, but ultimately still quite sparse, hence why a lot of fans of this story-rich franchise don't tend to think of it highly. However, that mentality cannot be applied to the sequel. That first game was a nice training ground, and despite what you may have been led to believe, it wasn't a training ground for Metal Gear Solid, but Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. People tell you MGS1 is where the franchise begins proper, but I promise you that couldn't be further from the truth. It was only 1990, we had just entered a new decade, but the 8-bit era wasn't over just yet. At this point, there had been enough experimentation in the industry to know how prior experiences could be iterated on to allow for better gameplay with a wider mass appeal. Some franchises needed that technological leap, but Metal Gear managed without it. The first game was ambitious for its innovations in an untested genre, but this game innovated in many new ways which existing fans are no stranger to. Enemies still go down easily and aren't that bright, but they do have some semblance of peripheral vision now. Crawling, in order to get through new routes or just hide under things, was introduced, and so was distracting enemies with sound. Unlike later entries, they won't usually go to the precise spot from which the sound came, but confusing them for a bit is still a good way to make it easier to slip by. Here's a tip: a confused enemy will not leave the screen they're on until they've forgotten about you. Yeah, moving between screens is now something that the enemies can do, hence why you now have the Soliton radar on your side. This not only gives you a heads up for when a guard is going to walk on screen where they can see you, but it also means you have no excuse for when you switch screens and are spotted immediately. Obviously, the stealth mechanics aren't quite at MGS2 levels of complexity, but it's pretty damn close to the benchmark set by MGS1. Hell, I'd argue they've aged better than MGS1. I always felt that CQC in that game was a bit stiff and awkward. It felt like it was too easy to flip the enemy when you wanted to choke them and vice versa. MG2 only has the punch, and if you ask me, I think having only one CQC option that works reliably at all times is better than having a handful of so-so options. The adventure aspect has also been improved tremendously. Instead of rescuing prisoners, now you find war orphans who have found asylum in this base, and you can actually talk to them more than once. This means that the need to commit everything to memory is heavily mitigated. The codec, while still not as reliable as it is in later games, has also been improved upon. There are still instances where they won't give you any specific advice if you aren't in the right area, but even then, they'll usually tell you something you can make use of. Master Miller is somehow simultaneously the most useful and most worthless member of your support team. Like, hell yeah, Kaz, I'm rehydrating just for you, babe. Wanna help me find the next keycard, though?
I'm not telling.
Oh, speaking of which, they were nice enough to streamline the card keys, using these colored ones which stack 3 of them together. The last one's kinda worthless though, since by the time you can get it, you've basically beaten the game already. There's also no longer any bits where the game just straight up doesn't tell you what to do. Well, except maybe the part where you need to use the paraglider and they don't tell you need to smoke your cigarettes for the wind to blow north. Something you'll absolutely need to look up, unless it's included in the Master Collection, which I guess it might be, is the code card. It's only used in a handful of sections, and it was probably meant to be more for copy protection than to be used as an immersive game mechanic, but it's still a really neat addition, and one that tracks really well with some of the other crazy metagame shit Kojima likes to do. All that said, by far the biggest leap this game makes from its predecessor is the story. Metal Gear 1 had some nice little nuggets of story and character, but it didn't really culminate to much, and it wasn't anything terribly meaningful or remarkable. Metal Gear 2, on the other hand, this shit is beautiful. Characters from the first game come back with new roles, their original fates reframed and their motivations brought to light. Some of the people you meet have backstories which intertwine with one another. They pour their heart out about their past experiences, and it plays into satisfying story arcs about the cruelty of war and the fruitlessness of its unending perpetuation in society. All this in a game released 11 months before Battletoads. Believe me, if you enjoy Metal Gear, this game has it all. It may not push the hardware to its limits, it may not have any real-time wanking or pressure-sensitive buttons or but it does hit all the notes that a Metal Gear fan wants to hear. It's got the challenging but satisfying gameplay, it's got the thought-provoking narrative, it's got the woke political commentary, it's got the heart and soul that gets poured into all the other games you know and love. What more do you want? And if you're not a Metal Gear fan, this honestly might be one of, if not the best place to start. I still think that Metal Gear 1 is a good starting point if you feel like you can tolerate its shit, but this game doesn't have a lot that requires tolerating because it's just that damn good. Anyway, I think we've officially reached the part that's just for existing Metal Gear fans. If you're a new fan, you probably won't understand much of what I'm talking about, and I'm gonna be spoiling a ton of stuff from this entire series, so proceed with caution or just skip to the outro with this timecode. Hopefully, I've been able to efficiently explain why I think these games are still worthwhile in terms of both gameplay and story while being looked at in isolation, but I think a lot of the you can just skip them mentality comes from people who believe that they just don't fit into the greater lore of the series or that they're ultimately inconsequential, and I couldn't agree less. For one, they're both referenced constantly in Metal Gear Solid 1. You know, the game that everyone says you should start with, the game that's always touted as the beginning despite it being the third game in the series. MGS1 also pulls tons and tons of plot elements and set pieces directly from MG2. How many? This many! I know there were in-game summaries for the MSX games, but how the fuck did anyone get by without these games? How did people listen to Snake talking about his previous tangos with Metal Gear, his fights with Big Boss, watching Grey Fox die in Zanzibar Land, and not once feel like they accidentally skipped something? The only thing I find weird is that Grey Fox's relationship with Gustava is never brought up again. I know that it's because this game has a greater emphasis on his relation to Naomi Hunter, but even a passing mention would have been nice. Oh, and there's the famous retcon of Snake somehow knowing Big Boss was his dad the whole time, despite that literally never coming up in either game. And when they fight at the end of MG2, Boss refers to himself as Snake's commanding officer, and not his fucking dad. One could argue that they had the father-son reveal at some point off-screen before MG1, but it's still a little weird. MGS2 also calls back to MG1 when the Colonel AI starts going all fucky-wucky on you, though he also references Ghost Babel, so you could argue that's not good evidence. More notably, Metal Gear Solid 4 has a brief callback to these games in the form of Raiden wanting to see Dr. Madnar again. Unfortunately though, Madnar doesn't get an on-screen appearance of any kind, not even a flashback, which I feel is a bit of a missed opportunity. Especially since, you know, I kinda thought he died in Metal Gear 2. I mean, maybe he just survived his wounds, but it still seems like an odd thing to gloss over. Snake doesn't even take a moment to say, "Dr. Madnar, I remember him. I didn't know he was still alive.
Hope his daughter Ellen's okay.
There is one other continuity oddity in MGS4 though. The entire crux of MG2's plot is the creation of Oilix and how Big Boss had to kidnap Kyo Marv to prevent the oil crisis from being solved, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to further his endless cycle of war. You beat him, recover Marv's MSX card containing the Oilix formula, and then everyone celebrates a job well done.
It's Christmas Eve, would believe.
But then MGS4 outright states that the oil crisis is still going on and is still one of the biggest reasons the war economy is thriving. I wonder how much of this would have been addressed in the original concept for Metal Gear Rising, the one where Kojima was at the helm, and instead of being a new era for the Metal Gear timeline, it would have been an in-betweenquel, bridging the gap between MGS 2 and 4. Maybe Dr. Madnar would have been a major character since he allegedly saved Raiden's life after getting roboticized. Maybe the failure of Oilix would have been part of the plot, whether the technology was faulty or the market simply refused to adopt it. I always wish this scenario could have been shown to us in one way or another, even if it was just a comic book or something. Also, I didn't know this before writing this video, but apparently the Rising we did get has a line of dialogue about the Patriots looking into alternative energy sources. I suppose this could be seen as an allusion to Oilix. Perhaps we could assume Marv worked under the Patriots, and despite recovering the Oilix plans, they simply couldn't reach fruition in that 24-year gap. Although, out of all the things introduced in the MSX games, what I feel is most relevant to the series moving forward is Outer Heaven. Originally, it was nothing more than a military base you were sneaking into, and I don't think the name really had any special meaning. But with every new game, it would only be expanded upon. Liquid and Solidus Snake would take direct inspiration from Outer Heaven, constantly citing it as a representation of their dream to take down the Patriots and finish their father's work despite hating the man's guts. MGS4 followed up on this by having Liquid Ocelot establish a brand new Outer Heaven PMC and an Outer Haven to go along with it. Kojima probably just thought the name sounded cool when making the first Metal Gear, but evidently, it felt important enough to him that in spite of all the other retcons and shit he made, he never let that bit go, always keeping it as part of the overarching plot of Metal Gear while also remaining true to Big Boss's philosophies, how his ideal world, his Outer Heaven, was one filled with endless war to ensure that his fellow soldier would always have a place in the world. We'd eventually get to see the original Outer Heaven in its blossoming years in Phantom Pain, and while I generally detest the Missing Link saga, I do still like the idea of Big Boss using a Phantom to control Outer Heaven by proxy. The execution sucked, but it was one of the very few things these games actually contributed to the overarching narrative, and I think it's a good one. I like that it effectively retcons Boss's monologue to Snake at the end of MG1. Instead of, "You fool, you didn't kill me," it became, "You fool, you didn't kill me." But of course, if you're truly a passionate fan of this series, one who appreciates the commentary and messages of these games, you've probably at some point internalized the advice. Don't focus too much on the words, find the meaning behind the words. And as such, you may find yourself less concerned with the continuity, but more with the theming. And I think that in spite of everything going against them, Metal Gear 1 and 2 still carry the themes we all know and love about this franchise. Metal Gear 1's relative lack of story may be seen as a negative, but I think that it unintentionally helps a lot. The first game was all about Snake's first real mission, when he was so young and didn't know a whole lot about the world. He was a child soldier who grew up knowing nothing but taking orders from his superiors. It isn't until Operation Intrude N313 when he finds himself being blatantly lied to by his commanding officer, only to realize that the man he looked up to was the mastermind behind the entire op and needed to be wiped out in order to finish the mission. The sequel follows up on this by having characters directly explain to us why they idolize Big Boss, why they're willing to betray the war hero who saved their lives in the previous game under Boss's order. Kyle Schneider was about to be killed by the US government, then Boss saved his life. Dr. Madnar was ostracized by the scientific community, and then Boss gave him the opportunity to create Metal Gear. Gray Fox was always loyal to him and explains that it's because fighting for a perpetual military force was the only purpose he could find in life. Then, as we leave him dying on the floor, we go fight Big Boss for the second time. No time to be distracted by a horrible revelation about the man's true nature. Instead, we listen to his plans to ensure there's always a place for soldiers in the world. To set the world on fire, douse the flames, rescue the survivors, and use them to repeat the cycle again. MGS3 let us know more about Naked Snake before these times. We saw how he was forced to kill the woman he always looked up to as soon as the government had to get rid of her, and this was immediately after the boss explains that she herself had to kill her own husband for similar reasons. As he listened to her dying words, he felt inspired, not to fulfill her wish, but to do what he believed would prevent anyone from going through what she had gone through. And so, we end up here. Not once, but twice, Solid Snake needing to kill him to fulfill his mission, exposing himself to the fact that war is a meaningless conquest, devoid of any cause or moral compass. If you ever wondered why Snake repeatedly insisted that he isn't a hero, why he despised people's reverence for him, why he was so jaded to war, and why he wanted nothing more than to chill with his huskies, this is why. Whether you've realized it or not, these games are instrumental to the evolution of the character of Snake. If you've been a fan of this series this whole time but never played them, you effectively skipped a huge chunk of the main character's arc. But you know what? That's not an entirely bad thing. You actually have a unique perspective which I didn't. For me, these games were the introduction, the games that would ease me into Kojima's wild ride. But for you, they're an origin story. It's Solid Snake's equivalent to Operation Snake Eater. They're the true missing link of the series, except they weren't missing at all, they were just hiding in plain sight. To sum it up for those skipping all the spoilers, you're gonna be told by a lot of people that Metal Gear 1 and 2 are nothing special or that they don't matter, and while they may not be chock full of everything that makes Metal Gear special, they still have plenty to make them matter a lot. There are undeniable problems with the gameplay and design, but if you ask me, they don't even come close to ruining the experience. And if it's story you're after, you may not find anything that'll rock your world, but you'll sure as hell find a lot to enjoy. And if you liked this video, leave a like, subscribe if you want to listen to more of my unwarranted opinions, and leave a comment wishing everyone a turtle Christmas.